The morning Harriet Bancroft arrived in Dust Creek, Nevada, with nothing but a carpet bag, a broken promise, and a one-way ticket she couldn't afford to use. The sun was already punishing everything beneath it with the particular cruelty that only the desert understood. She stepped off the stagecoach with dust on her hem and dried tears on her cheeks, and the first thing she noticed about the town was that it looked exactly the way she felt: exhausted, sun-bleached, and hanging on by the thinnest thread of hope it could manage. The second thing she noticed was that the general store across the rutted Main Street had a sign in the window advertising a position for a clerk, and that sign looked like the only piece of good news that Nevada had been willing to offer her since she crossed its border. It was 1878, and the West was still very much wild, whatever the railroad companies and the newspaper men back east wanted people to believe. Dust Creek sat in the high desert of Nevada like a forgotten coin between couch cushions, too small to be important, too stubborn to disappear. There was a saloon, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on Wednesdays, a blacksmith, and that general store, which was owned by a heavyset man named Gerald Prout, who smelled perpetually of tobacco and whose wife had left him 3 years prior and taken his better nature with her. Harriet was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair and eyes the color of strong tea, and she had come to Dust Creek because she had nowhere else to go. The man she had followed west from Cincinnati had proven himself to be exactly the sort of man her mother had warned her about: charming at a distance and thoroughly worthless up close. He had taken the money she had saved over 2 years of seamstress work, promised her a life in California, and then simply vanished somewhere between St. Louis and the Nevada border, leaving her with nothing but a half-used book of matches, a carpet bag of clothes, and the particular humiliation of being a woman alone in a territory that did not especially care for women who were alone. She had stopped in Dust Creek because she had run out of stage fare, which she would later come to believe was the only genuinely good thing that Thomas Albrecht had ever accidentally done for her. Gerald Prout hired her on the spot, mostly because his previous clerk had drunk himself into a ditch outside of town and hadn't come back, and partly because Harriet looked at him with such a clear, direct, unflinching gaze that he felt instinctively that she was not someone to be trifled with. He offered her $3 a week, a small room above the store, and the use of the iron stove in the back room on cold mornings. She accepted without haggling and went upstairs to unpack her carpetbag into a room barely larger than a wardrobe. She unpacked a second dress, a wool shawl, a small framed photograph of her mother taken before the fever, a leather-bound journal she hadn't been able to bring herself to write in since Ohio, and a single pressed flower from a garden she no longer had access to. She set these things out with the quiet deliberateness of someone building a temporary life, because that was exactly what she intended it to be. Dust Creek was a stop, not a destination. She would work, she would save, and she would get herself back to Cincinnati, where her aunt still lived in a narrow house on Maple Street and had written once to say the room above the kitchen was available if Harriet ever needed it. Home. She just needed to get home. She had no way of knowing that home would stop meaning Cincinnati within the span of a single Nevada summer. Arthur Collier came into the general store on a Thursday morning in late April, and Harriet was standing on the step stool behind the counter trying to reach the top shelf where Gerald kept the tobacco tins. She heard the bell above the door jangle, heard boots on the wooden floor, and then heard a voice that was low and unhurried say, "I can reach that if you need a hand." She turned around on the step stool, which was a mistake because it wobbled, and she grabbed the shelf with one hand and looked down at the man who had spoken. He was standing about 3 feet away with his hat already off, which she noted, because most men in Dust Creek had to be reminded twice about that particular courtesy. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean in the way that outdoor work makes a man lean, with dark hair that was slightly too long and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. His eyes, when she managed to get a clear look at them, were a shade of brown so dark they were almost black, and there was something in them that was simultaneously watchful and kind, a combination she had not encountered very often and therefore noticed immediately. "I'm perfectly capable of reaching it myself," she said, which was not entirely true, but she was not in the habit of accepting help from men she hadn't been introduced to. "I don't doubt it," he said, without a trace of mockery. He put his hat on the counter and waited. She got the tobacco tin down without any further wobbling, stepped off the stool with as much dignity as the situation allowed, and set the tin on the counter. "What can I do for you?" "Looking for fence wire and a box of nails," he said. 40 penny if you have them." She did. She found them, calculated the cost, and wrote it in the ledger without asking his name, which was how transactions worked in Dusk Creek, where everybody already knew everybody and nobody needed to announce themselves. But apparently he was the exception, or perhaps he simply possessed better manners than average, because he extended his hand across the counter and said, "Arthur Collier. I have the quarter section east of the Halliwell Ranch." She shook his hand. His grip was firm, but not the kind that tried to prove something. "Harriet Bancroft," she said. "I've been here about 3 weeks." "I know," he said. "Dusk Creek notices new people. Are you settling?" It was such a direct question that it caught her slightly off guard. "I'm saving," she said, "to go back east." Something shifted in his expression, not disappointment, not quite, but something adjacent to it that came and went so quickly she wasn't entirely sure she had seen it at all. "Fair enough," he said, and took his wire and nails and put his hat back on and walked out. She watched him go and then turned back to the ledger and found that she had written his name in the margin without realizing it. She crossed it out. He came back the following Thursday for lamp oil and salt, the Thursday after that for flour and cornmeal. It became, over the course of those early weeks, a reliable rhythm, Arthur Collier appearing every Thursday morning with a list in his shirt pocket, and a manner so consistently steady and unhurried that Harriet began to look forward to Thursdays in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything in quite a long time. He was not a talkative man, she learned, but neither was he one of those men whose silence was aggressive or dismissive. When he spoke, it was because he had something worth saying, and what he said was generally worth listening to. He told her things about Dusk Creek, which families had been there the longest, which of the 2 men who ran the town council was honest and which wasn't, where the best water was in summer and which draws flooded in spring. He told her about his land, which he'd homesteaded 4 years ago after coming west from Missouri, and about the cattle he was slowly building toward a proper herd. He told her that the desert looked dead, but wasn't that if you knew how to look at it. It was absolutely alive with things that had simply learned how to survive under difficult conditions. "Sounds lonely," she said one Thursday, and then was embarrassed that she had said it because she hadn't meant to say it and it seemed presumptuous. He considered it seriously, the way he considered everything. "It was for a while," he said. "Depends on what you fill the quiet with, I suppose." "What do you fill it with?" He looked at her for a moment across the counter, really looked, the way people rarely did, and then smiled, which transformed his face in a way that was somewhat disorienting. "Right now I'm finding that Thursday mornings help considerably," he said, and picked up his goods and left. Harriet stood at the counter for a full minute after the bell above the door stopped jangling, and then she went into the back room and pressed her hands to her cheeks and told herself firmly that she was going back to Cincinnati, and that was the end of it. The summer came on like something that meant to punish the desert for existing. The heat turned the main street of Dusk Creek into a shimmering mirage between noon and 4, and people moved through the hottest hours slowly, and with the kind of glazed determination that prolonged heat produces. Harriet kept the store cool by opening the back door each morning and closing the shutters at the front, and she filled the time between customers by mending things for women in town, adding a few extra cents each week to the small tin she kept on the windowsill in her room above the store. The tin was for her ticket home. She counted the money every Sunday morning the way some women counted their blessings, methodically, faithfully, with hope. She had been in Dust Creek for 2 months when she met Arthur Collier somewhere other than behind a counter for the first time. It was a Sunday evening, and there was a gathering at the church. A social, the kind that small western towns organized regularly as a bulwark against the isolation, with music and pie and the general performance of community. Gerald Prout had told her to go, mostly because it meant he could have the store to himself to drink whiskey and feel sorry about his wife without an audience. She put on her better dress and her good boots and went, and felt immediately the particular awkwardness of a newcomer at a gathering where everyone else had years of shared history. People were kind enough. Women introduced themselves and pressed pie plates into her hands and asked where she was from, which led to the inevitable questions about what had brought her west, which she answered with a version of the truth that omitted Thomas Albrecht entirely and reduced her presence in Dust Creek to a vague notion of travel and opportunity. She was standing near the window with a cup of apple cider, and the feeling of being very slightly out of place when Arthur Collier appeared at her elbow. He was wearing a clean shirt and his hair had been combed, which she found somewhat charming. He was holding a slice of peach pie and looking comfortable in a way that people who have been somewhere long enough to belong always do. "You look like you're calculating an escape route," he said quietly, without looking at her, which made it easier somehow. "I was trying to remember the names of everyone I've been introduced to in the last hour," she said. "That's Mrs. Durnan near the door. Her husband runs the livery, and she'll talk to you about her roses for as long as you're willing to stand still. The tall man by the piano is Judge Harlan Cole, who is technically a circuit judge, but mostly just a man who likes the sound of his own authority. The woman in blue is Clara Webb. She's a school teacher, the honest kind, and you'd probably like her." Harriet looked where he was looking and matched the people to his descriptions and found them accurate. "You know everyone. 4 years is enough time to know a small town," he said. "Why haven't you left?" she asked, and then immediately added, "I'm sorry, that was forward." "No, it wasn't," he said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was actually thinking about his answer rather than manufacturing one. "I tried leaving once, got as far as the California border and turned back." "What brought you back?" He looked out the window at the dark desert, which was purple in the evening light and absolutely beautiful in a way that she was only just beginning to understand. "The land," he said simply, "and the feeling that something was still here waiting for me." She looked at his profile and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who came back rather than kept going. She had always been a keeper-going person, she thought, or perhaps she had simply never had a reason to come back. Later that night, walking back to the store under a sky so full of stars it seemed almost excessive, she opened her journal for the first time since Ohio and wrote 3 sentences. "The sky here is the largest thing I have ever seen. I think I have been confusing movement with purpose for a long time. There is a man here named Arthur Collier who listens when people talk." She closed the journal and did not add anything else. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them in the slow, inevitable way that significant things tend to shift, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. He began staying a little longer on Thursday mornings, leaning against the counter and talking while she sorted inventory or filled orders for other customers. She began finding reasons to have the coffee pot on by 9, which was when he usually arrived. They talked about Missouri and Cincinnati, and what they had each expected the West to be versus what it actually was. They argued pleasantly about books. He had more of them than she would have expected, and opinions about them, and about whether the town council ought to spend the money on a proper well near the church or on reinforcing the bridge over the Wash, which had been threatening to collapse since the spring floods. She told him about her mother, which she hadn't told anyone since arriving in Dust Creek, and he listened without rushing her or offering the wrong kind of sympathy. She told him about the seamstress work and the years of saving, and the shameful, abbreviated story of what had brought her west. Not the sanitized version she gave to everyone else, but the real one, complete with Thomas Albrecht's name and the precise nature of her humiliation. She waited for him to say something comforting and inadequate, because that was what most people did. He said he was a coward and a thief, and the fact that you're still standing upright and making something of things says considerably more about your character than his behavior says about yours. She blinked. That's a very direct thing to say. You're a very direct person, he said. I didn't think you'd appreciate softening it. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I wouldn't have, thank you. He tipped his hat and left, and she stood at the counter feeling something in her chest that she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. It was the specific warmth of being genuinely known by someone. Not flattered or pitied or managed, but simply seen clearly and without either embellishment or apology. She went upstairs at noon and counted the money in the tin on the windowsill. She was about 6 weeks away from having enough for a ticket back east if she kept on at the current rate. Maybe 8 weeks if anything unexpected came up. She put the lid back on the tin and went back downstairs and thought about Thursdays. The unexpected thing came up in July, as unexpected things tend to do, and it came in the form of a woman named Della Prout, who was Gerald Prout's younger sister, and who arrived on the stage from Reno on a Tuesday afternoon in a state of considerable distress. Della was 32 and had recently been widowed, and she arrived at the general store with 2 trunks, a small dog, and a disposition that could most charitably be described as tempestuous. Gerald had, it transpired, promised his sister that she could come and work the store while he visited his brother in Sacramento, which he had somehow neglected to mention to Harriet, until Della was already standing in the store rearranging the layout of the candy jars, and announcing that she preferred things organized by size rather than type. "You'll still have your room," Gerald told Harriet, with the guilty face of a man who knew he had handled something poorly. "And I'll pay you for July. But Della will be running things while I'm away." "How long will you be in Sacramento?" Harriet asked. "Month, maybe 2, he said. Della Prout reorganized the entire store within 3 days, moved the lamp oil to where the flour had been and the flour to where the lamp oil had been, and took an immediate and thorough disliking to Harriet, which Harriet felt was both unfair and exhausting. Della seemed to operate on the theory that every woman within a 10-mile radius was a potential competitor for some resource that Harriet had not been able to identify, and she managed to communicate her displeasure through a series of pointed observations about Harriet's organizational methods, her handwriting in the ledger, and the way she arranged herself when male customers came in. "You smile too easily," Della told her one morning. "I smile at customers," Harriet said. "That seems appropriate." "Some customers more than others," Della said, with a particular emphasis that made her meaning perfectly clear. Harriet did not dignify this with a response, but she felt her cheeks warm in a way that annoyed her considerably. Arthur noticed the change the following Thursday. He came in and found Harriet behind the counter with her posture slightly more rigid than usual and her expression carefully neutral, and he looked from her to Della Prout, who was loudly reorganizing a shelf in the back with an energy that seemed partly legitimate and partly aggressive. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly, setting his list on the counter. "Perfectly fine," Harriet said. He looked at her. He was very good at looking at people in a way that communicated that he didn't entirely believe them but was not going to press the point, which she had come to find both comforting and faintly maddening. "I'll have your order ready in a moment," she said. He leaned on the counter and dropped his voice. "I was thinking, if you have Sunday free, there's something I'd like to show you. Something about the land out east of town. I think you'd appreciate it." "But I understand if—" "Yes," she said, and then felt immediately that she had answered too quickly. "I mean, yes, that sounds agreeable." Something in his face softened in that particular way it did sometimes, when he was pleased but not showy about it. "I'll come by at first light," he said. "Bring the shawl. Mornings are still cold." She thought about this for the rest of the week with a mixture of anticipation and self-directed irritation that she was not entirely sure how to categorize. Delaprout caught her tucking her good shawl into the carpet bag on Saturday night, and gave her a long look that Harriet ignored with what she felt was considerable dignity. Arthur arrived on Sunday morning with 2 horses, his own bay gelding and a calm, dappled mare he'd borrowed from the livery, because he had apparently thought about the fact that he did not know how much riding she had done. This consideration so precisely matched the way he did everything that she almost smiled just looking at him, standing in the street with the early light behind him, and his hat at the practical angle that men wore when they were actually working rather than performing. They rode east as the sun came up, and the desert transformed itself in the way it did at that hour, the light coming in low and gold, turning the scrubby sage and the red rock into something that looked painted rather than real. Harriet was not an especially experienced rider, but the mare was patient, and after the first half-mile she found her seat and stopped thinking about it and started looking. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Patience," he said, and she heard the smile in it even though his face was toward the horizon. They rode for about 40 minutes, which put them well east of town and into the low hills where the land folded and creased in interesting ways. He led her up a narrow track and then around a bend in the rock, and then she saw it. It was a small valley, not much more than a bowl between the hills, and it was absolutely full of wildflowers. Not a few, she had seen scrubby desert wildflowers before, the stubborn little things that pushed up through the baked earth in 2s and 3s. This was a profusion, a riot, a whole argument in favor of the desert made entirely out of yellow and purple and orange and white. In the center of the valley, a thin spring ran over a bed of flat stones, and the combination of the water and the shelter of the hills had produced something extraordinary. She reined the mare to a stop and stared. "Every year," Arthur said, pulling up beside her, "right about this time. It doesn't last long too, maybe 3 weeks, and then the heat burns it off. But while it lasts, it's extraordinary," she said. He was quiet, watching her face rather than the flowers, and something about the quality of his silence made her very aware of it. "I thought you should see it," he said, before he stopped. "Before I go," she finished, and she said it because it needed to be said, because it was true, because the tin on the windowsill was filling up, and this was all temporary, and she had known that from the first day. She had not expected it to feel quite like this. "Before you go," he agreed quietly. They stayed there for an hour. He told her about finding the valley in his second winter here, when he had been more alone than he cared to admit, and the desert had felt endless and unforgiving, and coming around that bend and finding this. She told him about the garden her mother had kept in Cincinnati, not large, just a narrow strip alongside the fence, but her mother had tended it with the kind of devotion that turned small things into something sacred. "She sounds like someone worth missing," he said. "She was," Harriet said. "She died 4 years ago. That's part of why I want to go back. My aunt is getting older, and she's the last family I have there, and I don't want to leave it too long before." She paused. "Before things change." "That makes sense," he said, and he meant it, she could tell. He didn't argue with it or try to talk her out of it or make her feel guilty for having something that mattered to her back east. He just acknowledged it, and she found his acknowledgement both grateful and, confusingly, a little painful. On the ride back, they talked less and rode closer together than was strictly necessary given the width of the trail, and neither of them mentioned it. Gerald Prout came back from Sacramento in mid-August earlier than expected, and in considerably lower spirits than he'd left, because his brother had turned out to be in financial trouble, and Gerald had lent him money he probably shouldn't have. Della departed the same day Gerald returned, with her trunks and her small dog, and a parting observation to Harriet that managed to be both insulting and entirely incoherent, and Gerald resumed managing the store with his usual mixture of indolence and tobacco, and left Harriet alone to run things. The tin on the windowsill by August had grown considerably. She counted one Sunday morning and found she had enough. Not comfortably enough, not with a great deal left over, but enough for a ticket to Cincinnati and a few weeks of modest living while she found work and settled in with her aunt. She had enough. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the small room above the general store and held the tin in both hands and thought about what having enough meant. It meant she could stop. It meant this part was finished. It meant she could walk to the stage station and purchase a ticket and be on her way within the week, back toward everything familiar, back toward her aunt and Maple Street, and the garden that might or might not still be growing alongside the fence. She put the tin down on the windowsill and opened her journal. She wrote, "I have enough money. I should be relieved. I don't understand why I'm not relieved." She closed the journal. She did not go to the stage station that week or the week after, and she told herself it was because the timing wasn't ideal, because she needed to give Gerald proper notice, because she wanted to make sure the accounts were in order before she left. These reasons were not entirely false, which made them useful. But she was honest enough with herself, in the small hours of the night when honesty was unavoidable, to know that they were not the main reason. The main reason came into the store every Thursday morning with a list in his shirt pocket and eyes that saw her very clearly. Arthur arrived on the Thursday after her Sunday counting of the tin and immediately sensed that something had changed. He was perceptive in that quiet way. He noticed things without making a performance of noticing them. He set his list on the counter and looked at her with the particular directness that she had stopped bracing herself against and started depending on, which was its own problem. "You look like someone who's made a decision and isn't sure how she feels about it," he said. She thought about denying it. "I have enough money," she said instead. He was still for a moment, just a moment, very brief, and then his expression settled back into its usual careful steadiness. "Enough for the ticket," he said. "Yes. When are you going?" It was such a simple, direct question, and it cut right through all the evasion she had been using for 3 weeks. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I keep finding reasons to wait." He looked at her across the counter, and the silence between them was full of things that neither of them had said, which had been accumulating all summer like water behind a dam that had been built too close to the top. "Harriet," he said, and the way he said her name, not as punctuation, not as courtesy, but as something deliberate and serious, made her breath catch. "Don't," she said softly, not unkindly. "I haven't said anything yet," he said. "I know, but if you do—" She started again. "I came here to get home, that's what this was. I have a plan, I have an aunt, I have a life waiting back east." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to give that up." "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his hat from the counter, turned it in his hands, set it back down. It was the only gesture of uncertainty she had ever seen from him. "I'm asking you not to go because of inertia or because leaving is inconvenient right now. If you want to go home, go home. But if you're staying because of—" he looked at the counter, then at her. "If you're staying for another reason, I'd like to know that too." She felt something shift in her chest, irreversibly, the way a key turns in a lock and the mechanism changes permanently. She had not wanted to feel this. She had been so careful not to feel this. "I haven't decided anything," she said. "All right," he said. And he picked up his goods and paid and put his hat on and walked to the door, and then stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "The valley will still be flowering for another week or so, in case that matters." He left. She stood at the counter for a long time, absolutely still, listening to the sounds of the street outside and the particular quality of the quiet he left behind him. That evening she wrote a letter to her aunt in Cincinnati. It was not the letter she had been intending to write for weeks, the one announcing her return date. It was a different kind of letter, a longer one, and in it she said things she had not said to anyone, and asked questions she had not allowed herself to ask, and at the end she sat back and looked at what she had written and felt both terrified and more honest than she had been in years. She did not send it yet. She folded it and put it in her journal. What she did instead, on that following Saturday afternoon, which was her afternoon off, was walk to the stage station at the end of Main Street and inquire about the next available seat on the eastbound stage to Reno, which connected to the Central Pacific Railroad and therefore to Cincinnati. The station manager, a thin man named Peavy who wore the same green suspenders every day, checked his book and told her the next available seat was on Tuesday's morning stage. She stood at his counter, and the word Tuesday sat in the air between them like a stone, and she thought about how many Thursdays there would be after Tuesday, none of which would involve Arthur Collier's hat on her counter and his voice talking about things worth caring about. "I'll come back," she said. "Stage goes whether you book it or not, ma'am," Peavy said, not unkindly. She walked back to the store and up to her room and counted the money in the tin again, because she needed something to do with her hands. Sunday she did not go to church. She went to the valley instead. She borrowed the dappled mare from the livery on her own, saddled her with help from the stable boy, and rode out east through the early morning light. The desert was cool and purple, and the trail was familiar now in the way that places become familiar when someone you care about has shown them to you. They acquire an extra layer of meaning, a double exposure, their own features overlaid with the memory of learning them. She came around the bend and the valley was still there, still flowering, though the edges of it were beginning to go dry and the colors at the margins had faded. There was still a heart of yellow and purple at the center where the spring ran, and she sat on the mare and looked at it for a long time. She heard hoofbeats behind her, which she had been half expecting and half hoping, and turned to see Arthur riding up the trail on his bay gelding, not looking surprised to see her there, which meant he was not surprised. "Did you know I was coming?" she asked. "I come here every Sunday morning this time of year," he said. "Wanted to see it before it goes." He pulled up beside her and they both looked at the flowers. "But also, yes," he added, "I thought you might come today." "How did you know?" "You had that look on Thursday," he said. "Like someone who was working something out." She looked at him sidelong. "You read me very easily." "No," he said. "It takes considerable attention." He paused. "I've been paying it." She looked back at the flowers. "I went to the stage station yesterday," she said. "I heard," he said, because of course he had, because Dusk Creek was that kind of place. "I didn't book the ticket." He was very still beside her. The horses shifted and the spring ran over the stones, and the last of the wildflowers moved slightly in the morning air. "I don't know what to do," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in a long time. "I have a plan. I have had a plan since before I came here. Going back to Cincinnati, that's not a small thing. My aunt is there. The last of my family is there." "I know," he said, "and I've been hurt before," she said, which was harder to say. "I followed someone across the country and it was the worst decision I've ever made, and I swore that I would never." She stopped. "I swore that I would be smarter." "Is wanting to stay here stupid?" he asked, not defensively, genuinely. She looked at him. He was watching her with that full, even attention that she had never been able to deflect, and his expression was open in a way that she realized cost him something, because he was not by nature a man who made himself easily readable. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know what it is." "Can I tell you what I think?" he said. "Please." He took a breath. He was a man who chose his words the way other men chose tools, with care, and because they were right for the job. "I think you are one of the finest people I have ever met," he said. "I think you came here because of someone else's carelessness and built something real out of the wreckage of it, which takes more strength than most people have. I think you are right to be careful. I think you should go home to your aunt if that is what you want, and I think I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if you did." He paused. "I am not Thomas Albrecht. I would never take something from you and run. I want you to have everything, your aunt, your family, whatever you need from back east. I'm asking if there is room in that for this, for us, for trying." She felt the tears come, which she had not expected and which embarrassed her. She turned her face away and blinked hard. "Harriet," he said softly. "I'm fine," she said, with a wet kind of firmness that made that categorically untrue. "I know," he said, and there it was again, that acknowledgement, that simple, steady witness to whatever she was actually feeling, without trying to fix it or minimize it. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, which was not graceful, and then she turned back and looked at him directly, which was very much in her nature. "If I stayed," she said, "what exactly would you be proposing?" He looked at her with an expression that was serious and also, around the edges, quietly happy in a way that hadn't been there a moment ago. "A courtship honestly conducted," he said, "done properly. You'd stay in your room above the store and I'd call on you respectfully and we'd see what happens between two people who already know they like each other considerably." "That's very formal," she said. "You deserve formal," he said. "You deserve to be courted properly by someone who means it." She was quiet for a moment. The valley spread before them in its late glory, the spring running, the last of the flowers holding on. "All right," she said, and felt the words settle in her chest like something finding its right place. His expression was not triumphant. It was careful and warm and entirely genuine, which was so characteristic of him that it made her heart turn over in a way she was going to have to get used to. "All right," he said quietly, and they turned their horses and rode back through the flowering valley and out into the desert morning, which was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. The courtship was, as promised, conducted formally and honestly, which in a town the size of Dust Creek meant that everyone knew about it within 48 hours and had opinions about it within 72. Clara Webb, the schoolteacher, told Harriet privately that she thought Arthur Collier was one of the most decent men in the territory and that she was happy for them. Mrs. Durnan from the livery told her the same thing and then talked about her roses for 15 minutes. Gerald Prout looked at her with the expression of a man who has realized he may be about to lose a good clerk and said, gruffly, "He's all right, Collier is. Better than average." Arthur called on her on Sunday evenings. He would come to the store's front door at a respectable hour, and they would sit on the wooden bench outside and talk until the stars came out and the night air turned cold. And then he would stand and tip his hat and say good night and ride back out east to his quarter section. There was nothing rushed about it. He brought her wildflowers once, a small bunch of the valley flowers, cut in the last days of their season and wrapped in a piece of burlap, and she put them in a tin cup on the windowsill next to the coin tin and looked at them every morning while she dressed. She wrote to her aunt in Cincinnati, a different letter than the one she'd never sent, explaining that her circumstances had changed and she would not be coming back as soon as she had anticipated, and would her aunt write and tell her how she was doing, and how was the room above the kitchen, and whether the rose that grew along the side fence had come back this year. Her aunt wrote back, a long, warm letter that made her cry a little in the good way, and said that she was glad Harriet had found something worth staying for, and that she would keep the room above the kitchen always, but that she suspected Harriet was not going to need it much longer. She was perceptive, her aunt. In September, Arthur took her out to his land. The quarter section east of Halliwell Ranch was not much to look at in the conventional sense, flat in most directions, rocky in others, the sage and juniper growing in their stubborn, irregular way, the ground cracked and dry after the summer. But there was a creek that ran along the northern border, fed by the same underground system that fed the valley spring, and along the creek the trees grew thick and green, and the light through the leaves was the kind of light that turned everything it touched into something you wanted to keep. He showed her the cattle, not many, perhaps 40 head, but healthy and well tended, the beginning of something rather than the end of something which she found she liked. He showed her the house, which was small, built of adobe and timber, solid and honest and clean, with a front porch that looked west toward the town and windows that caught the afternoon light. "I built it big enough for more than one person," he said, not looking at her, looking at the house, "in case that was ever relevant." "That was optimistic of you," she said. "I prefer thorough," he said, and she laughed, which surprised her, because she had not laughed freely at anything in a long time before she came to Dust Creek, and now it seemed to come easily, which was something she had not expected from Nevada. He turned to look at her when she laughed, and his expression was so plainly delighted that she felt it like warm water. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that it doesn't change anything if the answer is not yet, or if there are things that need to happen first. You just tell me what you need." She felt very calm, which surprised her because she would have expected to feel nervous. "Ask me," she said. He turned to face her fully, hat in his hands, in the afternoon light in front of the house he had built big enough for more than one. "Harriet Bancroft," he said, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" She looked at him for a long moment, at the steadiness of him, the patience, the quality of his attention, the particular kindness that did not soften into weakness, the way he had listened to every true thing she had said and never used any of it against her. She thought about Cincinnati. She thought about her aunt's narrow house on Maple Street, and the room above the kitchen and the rows along the fence. She thought about the plan she had made in Ohio, the plan that had brought her west and through the worst of it, the plan that had kept her walking forward when everything else was in ruins, the plan that had ended without her quite noticing, with this man standing in front of her in the desert light asking her something she had not expected to want as much as she did. "Yes," she said. "I will." She meant it completely. He put his hat on, very carefully, and then took a single step forward and took both her hands in his, which was the most contact they had allowed themselves in all these weeks of Sunday evenings on the bench. And they stood like that for a moment in the creekside light, with the cattle moving in the middle distance and the desert stretching away around them. And she thought, "This is the least planned thing I have ever done, and it is the most certain I have ever felt." And she held onto both of those things because they were both true. They were married in the Dust Creek Church in October, on a day when the sky was that particular depth of blue that only comes in high desert autumn, and the air had a clean bite to it that made everything feel sharp and real. Clara Webb stood with Harriet, and Tom Halliwell from the neighboring ranch stood with Arthur, and nearly everyone in Dust Creek came, because that was the kind of town it was, small enough that a wedding was a community event, and large enough that it made a proper gathering. Gerald Prout, to his credit, appeared in a clean shirt and looked almost sentimental, which Harriet found unexpectedly touching. He had hired a young woman named Josephine to replace her at the store, and Josephine had immediately reorganized the candy jars by color, and Gerald had told her to put them back, and she had, and Harriet suspected they would get along fine. The ceremony was performed by the circuit minister, a man of great warmth and very long prayers, who married them in front of the whole town in the October light and called it a blessing, which Harriet thought was not an overstatement. Afterward, there was pie. She moved her things out of the room above the store and into the house along the creek, and the carpet bag, which had carried everything she owned from Cincinnati to Nevada, and which she had looked at with complicated feelings for the better part of a year, she folded carefully and put on the shelf in the bedroom closet, where it could stay for the rest of its life if it wanted to. On the shelf beside it, she put the small framed photograph of her mother. She kept the journal on the nightstand. The first winter on the quarter section was cold and clear and demanding, as first winters anywhere tend to be. The creek froze along its edges, and the cattle needed daily attention, and the house needed weatherproofing in ways that Arthur had underestimated slightly, which led to a memorable 2 days of effort involving a great deal of mud mortar, several words she would not have chosen to hear in a church, and the discovery that she was considerably more capable with tools than either of them had predicted. "Where did you learn that?" Arthur said, watching her seal a crack in the north wall with competent efficiency. "Watching a carpenter my mother hired when I was 12, she said. "I paid attention." "You pay attention to everything," he said, with such genuine admiration that she felt it all the way down. "I learned from someone who does," she said, and he understood exactly what she meant. The winter gave them something that the courtship, for all its warmth, had not fully had time to give them, which was the knowledge of each other under difficult conditions. They learned how to disagree without damaging things, which took some work in November when she thought the cattle rotation needed changing, and he didn't, and she turned out to be right, which she allowed him to acknowledge without making it into more than it was. They learned how to be quiet together without it being uncomfortable, which turned out to be one of the great gifts of being with the right person. They learned that he made better biscuits but she made better soup, and that this was a reasonable arrangement. She wrote to her aunt every month. Her aunt wrote back every month. They built a correspondence that was warm and real, and gave Harriet the particular comfort of knowing that home was not gone. It had simply expanded to include more geography. In the spring, Harriet discovered she was expecting their first child, and told Arthur on a morning when the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the sage was coming green again after the winter. He was outside fixing a fence post, and she came out of the house and down the porch steps and across the yard and said it simply, because she was a direct person and he appreciated that about her. He set down the post-hole digger very carefully, as though it were made of something fragile, and turned to look at her. His expression was something she had not seen before, the particular, unguarded joy of someone who has been given something they wanted very much but had not allowed themselves to expect too loudly. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am," she said. He crossed the yard to her in 2 steps and took her face in both hands carefully and said, "Are you all right?" "I'm very well," she said. "Are you happy?" She looked up at him in the spring morning, the creek rushing behind them and the sage coming back and the sky that impossible Nevada blue, and felt the truth of her answer in every part of her. "Yes," she said. "Arthur, yes." He pulled her close and held her with a care that contained years of steadiness and months of love and all the long reliability of the kind of man he was. And she felt, with absolute clarity, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wrote to her aunt that evening, and her aunt wrote back 6 weeks later with practical advice about the first months and something that made Harriet cry and smile simultaneously. A small pressed flower from the garden alongside the fence, tucked between the pages, because her aunt said she wanted some of the old garden to be part of the new one. Harriet pressed the flower into her journal, next to the page where she had written her first tentative lines about the size of the Nevada sky. The summer was easier than the previous one, as second summers in a place tend to be. She knew the rhythms now, the work, the heat, the neighbors, the particular way Dust Creek moved through the long days of July. Arthur took on a hand named Pete Donovan, a quiet, capable young man from Texas who slept in the barn and asked for nothing beyond honest wages. And with his help, the cattle herd expanded through the summer to something that was beginning to look like a real cattle operation rather than a careful beginning. Harriet started a kitchen garden along the south side of the house, in the strip of ground that got morning sun and afternoon shade. She planted what she could get seeds for tomatoes, beans, summer squash, a few herbs, and along the fence where it would get the most sun, a rose cutting she had purchased from Mrs. Durnan at the livery, who grew roses as a secondary calling. "That's ambitious," Arthur said, watching her work the ground one morning. "My mother always had a garden," she said. "I intend to as well." He watched her for a moment. "I'll put up a proper fence," he said, "so the cattle don't come at it." "I'd appreciate that," she said. He built the fence that weekend solid, well-made, as everything he built tended to be, and the garden grew with the particular vigor of things that are being properly cared for. And by August the tomatoes were extraordinary and the rose had put out its first blooms, 3 of them, deep pink against the adobe wall. She stood in front of those roses one evening and missed her mother with a sharpness that was also, strangely, a kind of gratitude, because feeling that sharpness meant her mother had been worth missing, had been someone real and significant and worth the ache of absence. She had learned this from Arthur, who talked about his own losses, his younger brother, gone in the war, his mother, gone before that, with a quiet honesty that had taught her to hold grief and love in the same hand without either one canceling the other. Their son was born on a morning in late October, a year after their wedding, almost to the day, when the first hard frost had whitened the sage and the creek ran black and cold in the early light. Arthur had ridden into town for the doctor when Harriet's labor began, and they had come back to find her doing absolutely fine under the competent assistance of Clara Webb, who had arrived uninvited and entirely welcome at the first sign of things beginning. The doctor declared everything medically satisfactory. Clara declared herself available for any further assistance and left a covered dish. Arthur held their son for the first time with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the universe is considerably larger and more astonishing than he had previously accounted for. And Harriet watched him and felt her heart do something that she didn't have words for, which she had come to understand was simply what love did sometimes when it had room to grow. They named the boy James Robert Collier James for Arthur's brother, Robert for Harriet's father, who had died when she was 7 but whose name she had always carried with her like a small, careful light. James Robert Collier was a decisive child from the beginning, loud about his preferences, clear about his displeasures, and entirely enchanting in the way of babies who have not yet developed any social inhibition. He slept badly for 3 months, which was educational, and then slept splendidly, which was redemptive. He regarded his father with tremendous seriousness, and his mother with an adoration so complete and uncalculating that it made Harriet feel, regularly, that she was the most important thing in any room that contained both of them. Arthur with their son was something she watched with a quiet, private joy that she did not always try to express, because it was one of those things that was better contained than translated. He was as patient with James as he was with everything else, and as present, that full, unhurried attention that she had noticed the first Thursday morning he had come into the store, turned now on the small person who had arrived to complicate and immeasurably enrich all their lives. The cattle operation grew steadily through the following years, solid and unhurried, which was the right way for it to grow. Arthur was not a man who cut corners or pushed beyond what the land could support, and the land rewarded him for this with reliable grass and water, and the slow accumulation of a herd that was worth something real. He sold cattle to the railroad camps as the line expanded east, and to the mining operations in the hills north of Dust Creek, and each year there was a little more in the account at the Dust Creek Bank, and a little less of the lean anxiety that had been the permanent background noise of those first years. Harriet kept the garden. It expanded with each season. The rows multiplied along the fence into a generous tangle that bloomed from May through September, and which visitors invariably remarked upon, and the vegetables fed them through the summer, and were preserved for winter in the small pantry she had insisted on adding to the south end of the house. She continued to mend for women in town, partly because it brought in a little extra and partly because she enjoyed the work and the conversations it generated, and because it kept her connected to the rhythms of Dust Creek in a way that living outside of town might otherwise have interrupted. Clara Webb remained her closest friend and became, over those years, almost like family. She came to dinner on Sunday evenings and held James on her knee and talked about books and the school and the extraordinary political currents that were reshaping the West, whether the West was ready for them or not. She talked about the way the land was changing, being divided and fenced and sold, the open range that the old cattlemen had depended on being carved up into private claims, the Homestead Act filling in the gaps with families like Arthur's who were both the cause and the beneficiaries of this transformation. "Do you think about what this territory looked like before us?" Clara asked one evening as she and Harriet sat on the porch in the last of the day's light while Arthur put James to bed inside. Harriet was quiet for a moment, looking out at the desert going purple in the evening. "I think about it more than I used to," she said. "The Paiute were here," Clara said, "for longer than anyone wants to count. And now," she gestured at the house, the garden, the cattle in the distance. "Now we are." "And they were pushed," Harriet said. "They were pushed," Clara agreed. "And we are the people who came after the pushing, and most of us don't think about that because it's uncomfortable, and because thinking about it doesn't change it." Does that mean we shouldn't think about it? No, Clara said. I think it means we should think about it more, not less. I teach the children here and I try to be honest about what this land cost. She looked at Harriet. The West isn't just what we made it. It was already something before we came. That matters. Harriet nodded slowly. She had not grown up thinking about these things with any particular clarity. She had come west caught up entirely in her own private disaster, and had been too occupied with survival to reflect on the larger shape of things. But she had 4 years of Nevada in her now, and the desert had a way of making things very plain, very large, and very unavoidable if you sat with them honestly. The beauty of this place and the injustice of its taking were both real. Holding both of those truths was not comfortable, but she thought it was probably necessary. I'll talk to Arthur, she said, about what we can do. We have what we have because of the Homestead Act, which is itself complicated, Clara said. Complicated, Harriet agreed. But that doesn't mean we can't be decent with what we've been given. Arthur, when she talked to him that night, was not defensive. He was the kind of man who was capable of looking at difficult things without needing them to be simple or convenient, which she had learned was rarer than it should have been. He nodded and was quiet and said he'd been thinking along similar lines, that Tom Halliwell, their neighbor, had been on better terms with the local Paiute families than most, and he'd talked to Tom about what decent neighborly conduct looked like in practice, and there were things they could do. They were not large things, but they were honest things, and she thought honesty was a better starting point than comfort. The years settled into themselves with the particular grace of things going well. James grew from a baby into a boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's directness, who was absolutely devoted to the horses, and who, by the age of 4, was already following Arthur around the property with the focused intensity of someone in training. Harriet found herself pregnant a second time when James was nearly 3, and this time it was easier. She knew what to expect. She knew the rhythms. She had Clara and the doctor and the particular confidence of someone who has done something once and found herself capable of it. She told Arthur on the porch one spring evening, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together looking at the garden and the desert, and the last of the day's light, without needing to say very much. Their second child was a boy again. They had a bet about it, good-natured, which Arthur won and which Harriet paid with a month of biscuit-making, and they named him Daniel, for no one in particular but because the name suited him from the first hour, being both solid and slightly surprising, like the man they thought he might become. Daniel was different from James in every way that mattered most. Where James was decisive and loud, Daniel was observant and peaceful, given to sitting very still in the middle of activity, and watching everything with calm dark eyes that made the doctor, at his 6-month check, say he had never seen a baby who seemed so thoroughly satisfied with the amount of information available to him. "He takes after your husband," Clara told Harriet, watching Arthur sit on the porch with Daniel in the crook of his arm and James climbing over his boots. "He does," Harriet said, and felt the warmth of it like sunlight. In the summer of 1884, which was their 6th year on the quarter section, Arthur came in from the south pasture one August evening and sat down at the kitchen table and told Harriet that Tom Halliwell had made him an offer. Tom was expanding. Tom was always expanding, and the land east of Arthur's quarter section had come available through a failed homestead claim, and Tom wanted to buy it, but it butted up against Arthur's water rights in a way that made the deal complicated, and Tom had proposed buying Arthur's creek rights along with the new parcel in exchange for a sum that was significant enough to change things. "How much?" Harriet asked. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. "That would pay off the mortgage," she said, "and have enough left over for the barn expansion you've been planning. And give up the creek rights," he said, "which matters how much in practical terms." He spread his hands on the table. "In a dry year, considerably. In a regular year, less so. There's still the spring on the north end." She looked at him across the table. "What do you think?" "I think it depends what we want the next 10 years to look like," he said. If we're building towards selling, the money makes sense now. If we're staying, we're staying, she said. He looked at her. You're certain? She thought about Cincinnati, about the plan, about the ticket she had never bought. She thought about the valley in spring and the house in the creekside light, and the rows along the fence that had been a cutting from Mrs. Durnan's, and was now a proper established thing. She thought about her aunt, who had come to visit them in 1882, a journey that had taken 3 days and that her aunt had described as the most extraordinary experience of her 62 years, and who had sat on this porch and looked out at the desert and said, in tones of genuine astonishment, that she could entirely see why Harriet had not boarded that stage. I'm certain, Harriet said. Tell Tom the creek rights aren't available, but if he wants to negotiate a shared water arrangement, we're open to it. Arthur smiled at her, the full version, the one that had first disoriented her across a store counter 6 years ago and had not lost its effect in any of the subsequent time. That's exactly what I was going to say, he said. I know, she said. That's why I said it first. He laughed and she laughed, and James called from the other room asking what was funny, and Daniel woke up from his nap and made the specific sound that meant he wanted his mother. And the evening came in gold through the west windows, and the roses along the fence caught the last of it and held it for a moment before the dark came on. They worked out a water agreement with Tom Halliwell that served both operations fairly, as neighbors who respected each other were capable of doing, and the following summer they put up the new barn with the money from the sale of the extra parcel on the southeast corner, a triangle of rocky ground that had never been particularly useful to them. And the barn was good and solid, built with Pete Donovan's help and 2 men hired from town, and the sustained effort of a husband and wife who were both, it turned out, entirely willing to work. Harriet wrote in her journal less often than she had in those first raw months, because there was more living to do and less processing required. But she wrote on significant days, on James's birthday and Daniel's birthday, on the anniversary of their wedding, on the anniversary of the Sunday. She had ridden alone to the valley and found Arthur already there, and said all right and meant it. On those days, she would sit at the kitchen table in the early morning before the household came properly awake and write a few pages about where they were and where they had been, building a record of a life that she was glad to be building. She wrote on one of those mornings in October of 1884, I bought a ticket once in my mind, the ticket back to the life I had planned, the small safe room above my aunt's kitchen, the known streets, the garden I knew. I thought that ticket was the thing I was saving for. I did not understand that what I was actually saving toward was the courage to stop needing it. She looked at what she had written and then added, I'm not sure I would recommend Nevada to everyone, but I would recommend Arthur Collier without reservation. She closed the journal and went to make coffee and found that Arthur was already up and the coffee was already made, which was one of the many small domestic kindnesses that had accumulated into the architecture of their life. You're up early, she said. James had a bad dream, he said. I sat with him for a while. He handed her a cup. He's fine now. She took the cup and stood next to him at the window, looking out at the morning desert, which was cool and still and impossibly beautiful in the way it always was before the heat arrived. Thank you, she said. He's my son, Arthur said simply. She leaned against his shoulder just slightly and felt the solidity of him, the reliable, steady, thoroughly present weight of a person who was exactly where he intended to be. There was a morning in the spring of 1885 when Harriet was in the garden, tying up the climbing rose that had by now spread beyond its original fence and was making serious claims on the porch railing. And she stopped working and looked up at the desert and thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Dust Creek with nothing but a carpet bag and a broken promise, and a one-way ticket she couldn't afford. That woman had been frightened and humiliated and alone, and she had been very clear about what she wanted, which was out, back, home, away from this red dirt nowhere that fate and Thomas Albrecht's cowardice had delivered her to. She had wanted the familiar. She had wanted safety, which she had confused with smallness. Harriet thought about her with something that was not quite pity and not quite pride, but was somewhere in the complicated space between them. That woman had been brave in the particular way that survival requires. Not the big dramatic kind of brave, but the daily, ongoing kind. The kind that involves simply not stopping, simply continuing to put one foot in front of the other when everything has gone wrong and the road ahead is invisible. She had kept going even when she hadn't wanted to. And then, without quite meaning to, she had kept staying. Harriet went back to tying up the rows and thought that this was perhaps the better kind of bravery. Not the kind that pushes through in crisis, but the kind that recognizes when something is worth settling into. The kind that looks at a man who has been nothing but patient and honest and steady and says, "Yes, I will trust this." The kind that lets the ticket expire. She had never bought it in the end. Arthur had offered to, in the early days of their courtship. He had said it absolutely seriously, with no performance, that if she needed the money to secure her passage home, he would give it to her, no conditions, because he wanted her to stay only if she chose to, and he never wanted her choice to be made from financial necessity. She had looked at him with a great deal of feeling when he said that, and told him she did not need it, and he had accepted this without pushing, and she had added it to the long list of things she had understood, through knowing him, about what trustworthy actually looked like when stripped of all performance. He came out of the barn now, across the yard, carrying something she couldn't immediately identify, and saw her in the garden, and raised his hand in the easy acknowledgement that people who have spent years in the same place make to each other, not a greeting exactly, more like a confirmation. There you are, there I am. Everything is as it should be. She raised her hand in return. James came running from somewhere behind the barn at a speed that indicated either great excitement or some minor catastrophe, and Daniel appeared in the doorway of the house with flour on his apron, because he had lately been helping her bake, and had decided that this was his primary interest in life, which she encouraged without reservation. She stood in the garden in the spring morning with the rose blooming along the fence and the desert spreading out beyond it, and her whole good life going about its ordinary business around her. And she felt the kind of happiness that is not dramatic or sudden, but has been built, carefully and with intention, over years. Her aunt had come again the previous fall, and stayed for a month this time, long enough to see the morning light on the desert, which she said was something that did not translate to description, and needed to be experienced directly. She had sat in the garden with Harriet one afternoon and held James on her knee and watched Daniel sleep in the cradle on the porch, and she had said, "Your mother would have loved this." Harriet had thought about that for a long time afterward. She thought her mother would indeed have loved it. The garden, the roses, the wide sky, the children, and most particularly the man who had built the fence to protect the first tentative seedlings and had never, in all the years since, given Harriet a single reason to regret trusting him. She thought her mother would have liked Arthur Collier a great deal. She walked across the yard to him now, because she wanted to, because that was the kind of marriage they had, one in which they walked toward each other. "What have you got?" she asked, looking at the thing he was carrying, which turned out to be a young rabbit that James had apparently found in the barn in some distress and had pressed upon Arthur for rescue. "A problem," he said, looking at the rabbit, which looked back at him with an expression of resigned skepticism. "James," she guessed. "He's already named it," Arthur said. She looked at the rabbit. The rabbit looked at her. "What did he name it?" "William." She pressed her lips together to suppress her smile, which was not entirely successful. "Well," she said, "we'd better find William something suitable to live in." Arthur looked at her with that expression, the warm, full one, and said, "I'll build a hutch." "Of course you will," she said. He handed William to her and went to find boards, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who built things, who fixed things, who made space for the people and the small chaotic joys that arrived unexpectedly in a life. The kind who built a house big enough for more than one, just in case it was ever relevant. the kind who would have bought her ticket without hesitation, and who was the reason she never needed it. The seasons moved through in the way they did in the high desert, with drama and beauty and the occasional spectacular indignity. And the Collier quarter section became, in time, the Collier Ranch, which was the kind of place where the gate was always in good repair, and the horses were well kept, and the garden was extraordinary, and people who came for dinner invariably stayed longer than they intended. James turned 7 and decided he would be a cattleman, which surprised nobody. Daniel turned 5 and decided he would do everything his brother did plus bake, which Harriet found entirely endearing. There were more animals than she had anticipated. William the rabbit had been joined by 2 more rabbits, a goat of uncertain temper that the boys had named Harold, and a dog of considerable personality named Bess, who had appointed herself guardian of the garden and took this responsibility with the seriousness of a professional. Arthur expanded the herd to nearly 200 head over those years, and the cattle operation was solid enough that the anxious years were genuinely behind them. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but in the slow, reliable way that careful work produces real results. He hired 2 more hands beside Pete Donovan, and the ranch had the feel of something that had found its right size and was growing toward its full expression. Harriet kept her garden and her mending and her correspondence with her aunt in Cincinnati, who wrote beautifully and with great warmth, and who had been, over all these years, the thread that kept Harriet connected to where she had come from without making her feel that where she had come from was where she needed to be. Her aunt came again when Daniel was born and when he turned 3, and each visit made the distance smaller in the way that genuine affection across distance tends to do, not by erasing the miles, but by making them less lonely. In the fall of 1886, Harriet discovered she was expecting again, and she told Arthur on the porch in the early evening with the desert going pink and the boys asleep inside, and the coyotes starting up somewhere out in the sage. "Third time," he said, looking at her with his full attention. "Third time," she agreed. "Are you frightened?" "Less than before," she said honestly, "more experienced." He reached over and took her hand, which was something they did easily now. They were people who touched easily, who had found in their years together the particular comfort of habitual nearness, the settled security of someone always beside you. "I'm glad," he said. "Arthur," she said. "I'm glad too," she said. "For all of it, I know I don't say that enough." He turned to look at her. "You say it in the way you do things," he said. "I hear it." She looked at him for a moment in the evening light. "When did you get so articulate?" she said. He smiled. "I've been practicing," he said. Their 3rd child was a girl, Clara Judith Collier, named for the schoolteacher who had stood with Harriet at her wedding and been her truest friend in Dust Creek, and for Arthur's mother, whose middle name had been Judith, and whose memory he kept with the same quiet faithfulness he kept everything. Clara was born in March when the desert was just coming out of winter, and the first spring wildflowers were pushing through, and she arrived with her eyes wide open and looking around with an alert curiosity that made the doctor say he had never seen a newborn so apparently interested in taking stock of the situation. "She's your daughter," Arthur said to Harriet, looking at the baby in her arms. "She's your daughter too," Harriet said. "Both of those things explain the look on her face," he said. Clara Webb came the next morning and held her namesake and wept thoroughly and unself-consciously, which Harriet found deeply moving. "Look at her," Clara said. "Just look at her." "She's lovely," Harriet agreed. "She's remarkable," Clara said, with the emphasis of someone who meant something very specific by that word. "She comes from remarkable people." Harriet looked at Arthur, who was pretending to read something in the corner and was doing so too quietly to be entirely convincing. "Yes," she said. "She does." Life in those years had taken on the particular texture of something fully inhabited, rich with detail and complication and pleasure, and the ordinary difficulties that are not crises, but are simply the ongoing work of being alive alongside other people. There were arguments and reconciliations in seasons that were harder than others in seasons that were so good they almost seemed wrong. There was illness. James had a fever one winter that frightened them considerably, and Arthur hurt his shoulder badly in a fall from the roof of the new barn in 1887, which kept him from riding for 6 weeks, and produced in Harriet a sustained anxiety. She managed mostly by being exceedingly competent about everything that needed doing, which Arthur observed from his forced rest with admiration, and something like guilt at being laid up when she was working so hard. "You don't have to do all of it," he said from the porch one afternoon. "You did most of it for 3 years before I was here," she said. "I think I can manage 6 weeks. "That's not the point," he said. "I know it's not the point," she said. "But you're going to sit there and rest until that shoulder heals, and I'm going to handle things, and when you're well again we're going to talk about the fact that you were on the roof in the first place without telling me." He was quiet for a moment. "That seems fair," he said. She looked at him. He was sun-browned and slightly frustrated at his own immobility, and there was a silver in his dark hair now that had not been there when she had first seen him across the counter in the general store, and she thought that he was handsomer now than he had been then, which she had not expected but which was entirely true. "How is the shoulder today?" she asked. "Better," he said. "Truly, truly," he said. "I'll be on a horse in a fortnight." She came and sat beside him on the porch bench, the same kind of bench they had sat on outside the store during their courtship, which was not a coincidence because he had built this one with that memory in mind, and leaned her head briefly against his uninjured shoulder, and he put his good arm around her and they looked at the desert in the afternoon light. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About going to Cincinnati," he said, "to see your aunt before she gets much older. I know you've wanted to for years." She lifted her head to look at him. "You'd leave the ranch." "Pete can manage for a few weeks," he said. "He's capable enough. I thought in the spring when the travel is easier, all of us." She stared at him. The children would love it. Her aunt would be undone completely by the grandchildren-level affection of James and Daniel and Clara. The prospect of standing in front of the rows along the fence on Maple Street with Arthur beside her and the children running in the narrow yard, "Yes," she said, very directly, which was entirely in her nature. "Yes." "Let's do that," he smiled. "Good," he said. "I'll write your aunt." She sat back and looked at the desert and thought about the stages of a life. The stage when home is the place you came from, and the stage when home is the place you've built, and eventually the long, beautiful stage when home is just wherever the people are. She had moved through all of those stages in Nevada, she thought, in the company of a man who had been worth every stage of it. They made the journey to Cincinnati in the spring of 1888, all 5 of them, which was a logistical undertaking of some proportion. 3 children ages 6, 4, and 1, 2 weeks of travel, and the Central Pacific Railroad, which was reliable but not exactly comfortable, and which James found so thrilling that he could barely be persuaded to sleep for the first 3 days. Her aunt was at the station in Cincinnati, which was large and loud and smelled nothing like Nevada, and she stood on the platform with her hands clasped together and her eyes bright. And when Harriet walked down from the train car with Clara on her hip and the boys running ahead and Arthur behind her carrying the bags, her aunt simply said, "There you are," and opened her arms. Arthur Collier stood on the Cincinnati train platform with 2 bags in his hands and looked at the woman who was his wife, who had grown up in the city and left it and found her way to Nevada and been brave enough to stay, and he felt something that was deep and full and completely without complexity. The simple, clean joy of a man who knows he is exactly where he is supposed to be. Harriet, with her face in her aunt's shoulder, was thinking something similar. They spent 3 weeks in Cincinnati. They walked up Maple Street and Harriet showed Arthur the narrow house and the rows along the fence, which was still growing, older and more established than the cutting that had come to Nevada, but unmistakably the same. Arthur bent down and looked at it closely and then stood up and said, "It's a good rose," which made her laugh. They walked past the house where she had grown up, which belonged to someone else now, which was fine. She looked at it for a long time and felt what she expected to feel, the ache of time, the particular tenderness of returned memory. And then she felt Arthur's hand find hers, and she held it, and they walked on. They visited her mother's grave, and she stood at it for a while and said things privately that she had needed to say for a long time, that she was well, that she was loved, that the garden in Nevada had roses now, that the children were wonderful, that she thought the life she had built was the right one. She thought her mother would have agreed. James and Daniel became completely enamored of their great-aunt and followed her around the house asking questions about Cincinnati and about Harriet when she was young, which her aunt answered with great enthusiasm and several stories that made Harriet say, "Aunt Eleanor, that is absolutely enough of that," while not being entirely able to keep a straight face. Clara, who was 1 year old and in the stage of development that involves pulling everything off every surface she could reach, systematically removed the contents of Aunt Eleanor's sideboard 3 times in a single afternoon, and Aunt Eleanor declared her the most interesting baby she had ever encountered, which was exactly the kind of grandmother-adjacent judgment that the situation deserved. On the last evening before they were to start back, Harriet and Arthur sat in the small garden behind her aunt's house while the children slept inside, and the Cincinnati summer night was warm and full of the particular sounds of an eastern city, carriages on cobblestones, voices from neighboring houses, the distant whistle of the train yards. "What do you think?" she asked him. "Of Cincinnati." He considered it in his thorough way. "It's a fine city," he said. "Big, orderly, green." He paused. "I prefer the desert." "So do I," she said, and was not surprised to find she meant it completely. He looked at her sidelong with the smile that still, after 10 years of marriage, could produce in her chest a warmth that was as reliable as it was lovely. "I wasn't sure that would still be true for you," he said. "Why not? Being here and seeing it, the place you came from. I thought it might pull," she said. "Yes," she thought about it honestly. "It feels like a visit," she said. "The way visiting somewhere you loved feels warm and real and slightly not quite mine anymore. Home is the desert. Home is the house and the creek and the garden." She paused. "Home is you." He was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid," he said slowly, "in those early months. When you were still talking about going back, when you had the money in the tin, when you went to the stage station, I was afraid you would go." "I nearly did," she said honestly. "I know." "What would you have done?" she asked. "If I had." He was quiet for a long moment. The Cincinnati night moved around them, warm and full. "I would have let you go," he said, "because that's what you do when you love someone honestly. You don't hold them. You just make sure they know they're worth staying for, and then you let them decide." He paused. "But I would have been very significantly sorry." She looked at him. "Arthur Collier," she said. "Harriet Collier," he said. "I am very glad I did not board that train," she said. He reached over and took her hand. "So am I," he said. "Every day." The stars were coming out above Cincinnati, faint against the city lights, not the vast blaze of the Nevada sky, but present, reliable, the same stars. She leaned into his shoulder and thought about the girl who had stepped off a stagecoach with a carpet bag and a broken promise, and the particular, painful determination of someone who has been badly let down, but has not yet decided whether to trust the world again. She had decided, eventually. It had taken a valley full of wildflowers and a man who left his hat on the counter and listened when she talked and meant everything he said. It had taken courage that looked very much like simply not leaving, which turned out to be the most profound choice she had ever made. The train back to Nevada left at 7 in the morning, and all 5 of them were on it. Arthur with Daniel asleep against his arm, Harriet with Clara drowsy in her lap, James pressed against the window watching Cincinnati give way to countryside with the rapt attention of a boy for whom the whole world was still new enough to be astonishing. Her aunt had stood on the platform and waved until the train was fully out of sight, and Harriet had watched her until she couldn't see her any more, and then she had turned back to the car and to her family and felt, clearly and completely, that she was going home. Nevada received them in the way it always did, enormous and sun-hammered and indifferent, and once you knew how to look at it, filled with a fierce, specific beauty that had no patience for sentiment but rewarded genuine attention absolutely. The stage from Reno brought them to Dust Creek on a late afternoon when the light was horizontal and gold, and Main Street was dusty and familiar and entirely itself, and Pete Donovan was at the livery with the wagon to take them out to the ranch. The house looked beautiful in the late light. The rose was at its peak. The deep pink blooms crowded along the fence in the August heat, and James said, "We're home," with the certainty of someone who has no doubts about what that word means. And Arthur caught Harriet's eye over the top of the wagon, and she smiled at him with everything. He helped her down from the wagon with his hands on her waist, which they had done 100 times, 1,000 times, the ordinary contact of a marriage that had become the architecture of their days. He kept his hands there a moment longer than the move required, and she looked up at him. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and meant it in every way that word could mean. The children poured off the wagon and into the yard, and Bess, the dog, came bounding from the barn in an ecstasy of reunion. And Harold the goat appeared at the fence with an expression of reproach that communicated his feelings about their absence clearly. And Pete was saying something about the south pasture that Arthur would need to look at tomorrow, and the evening light was on everything. And Harriet stood in the middle of all of it and breathed the sage and dust air of Nevada, and felt the kind of happiness that is not a feeling but a state, something that has been built and maintained and chosen daily, and has therefore become something you can stand on. She went inside to start supper, and the house was warm with the stored heat of the day, and everything was exactly where she had left it. The journal on the nightstand, the small framed photograph of her mother on the shelf, the pressed flowers in the tin cup on the windowsill, and beside them, empty now and no longer needed, the old tin that had held the money for a ticket she had never bought. She stood at the kitchen window and watched Arthur cross the yard to talk to Pete, the boys running circles around him and Bess leaping at their heels and Clara watching from the porch step with her enormous dark eyes. And she thought, "This is the view I will have for the rest of my life," and felt nothing but gratitude for it. She picked up the old empty tin and turned it in her hands. She had bought it at Gerald Pruitt's store in her first week in Dust Creek for 3 cents, a small blue tin with a faded label, and she had put her first week's wages in it and begun the long, patient work of saving her way back to where she had come from. She had never gotten there. She had gotten somewhere better. She set the tin on the windowsill where it had always been and went back to starting supper, and outside the window the desert went purple and gold in the evening, and her husband's voice carried across the yard, and her children made the sounds of children who have come home, and the rows along the fence held the last of the light. She was where she was supposed to be. She had known it, really, for a very long time.